So in this video, we're going to be exploring the concepts of economic efficiency and deadweight loss, only due in this case to price controls. Okay, so before watching this video, I would highly recommend that you first watch my previous video on price controls, which I believe is just entitled Price Controls, okay, where we explore the concept of a price ceiling and a price floor and its effects on prices and quantities exchanged. Okay, so for the sake of this video, we're going to be talking about the concept of economic efficiency. Okay, so let's draw our familiar graph of the demand curves and the supply curves, and let's now interpret this graph in a way that's slightly different than how we've been interpreting it in the past, but it follows directly from it. So it's not that big of a jump. Okay. All right. So, so let's start as we always do by defining our equilibrium point, complete with equilibrium quantity. And equilibrium price. Okay. Now, let's ask ourselves what benefit consumers and suppliers are deriving in this market. What do I mean by benefit? Okay. If I go to the store and I offer, let's make it simpler than that. If you're selling me your used car, right? So you sell me the used car, you say, all right, I'll offer it to you at a price of $5,000 and I accept, okay? And I buy your used car from you at $5,000. Now we have both derived a benefit from that exchange. If I valued my $5,000 more highly than I valued the car, then I would never have bought it from you for $5,000, right? If that $5,000 is more valuable to me in my pocket, then there's absolutely no point of exchanging it for a car which I value less than the $5,000. The only reason I bought the car is presumably that I value it at more than $5,000. So whatever extra I get, whatever extra value I derive from the car than for the $5,000, that's my benefit as a consumer. And similarly, for you as the supplier or the seller, you must value my $5,000 more highly than you value your car. So therefore, you gain some benefit as well, okay? So we are going to see that idea of a benefit can be captured by this graph, okay? Now, let's just define a few things here. So, consumer surplus, which I'm going to abbreviate as CS, is defined as total benefit derived by consumers and producer surplus is total benefit derived by producers or suppliers. Okay. Now, producer surplus is not the same thing as profit. Okay. And we'll see that they're defined differently. It's actually not important for the purposes of this video how profit is defined. We're actually going to define profit in a later video, but for now, just keep that at the back of your mind, okay? Producer surplus is not the same thing as profit. In this video, we're concerned with producer surplus. Now, let's start by defining consumer surplus on this graph. How can we describe the total benefit derived by all consumers in this market? Let's take a random point and start there. Let's take this point here. Okay, this point has a corresponding price, P1, and it has a corresponding quantity, Q1. Now, at this price level, and this is what the demand curve tells us, right? Because that point is on the demand curve. At this price level, some number of consumers are willing to buy whatever good this is. Specifically, consumers are willing to buy Q1 units of the good at a price P1, right? Okay, well, lucky for those consumers, they don't actually have to pay P1. They only have to pay PE, right? They're willing to pay P1, but they only have to pay PE. Another way of looking at this is that they value Q1 units of this good at P1, but only have to pay PE for it, okay? So what is the extra benefit that they receive from this transaction? Well, if you multiply Q1 by P1, right, this is their total value, okay? So you have Q1 units of the good being valued at P1. Multiply them together, you get total value, right? But of course, you also, if you want to get the extra value, you can't just multiply Q1 by P1. You also have to subtract PE multiplied by Q1 because that's the amount that they have to pay, right? Minus Q1, right, times PE. Graphically, I hope you can see that that is represented by this rectangle, right? P1 times Q1 minus PE times QE, leaving us with this rectangle. Okay, now, this exercise that I just did can be done for every infinitesimal sliver of this line here. I could divide our Q line between 0 and QE into infinitesimally small rectangles, right? Like that. And I could calculate the total benefit that would be derived, or the total extra benefit that would be derived by each of these tiny, tiny, tiny small rectangles, okay? Now, I hope you can see, as those rectangles get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, what am I left with? Well, I'm left with the entire area of this triangle. Right? So at P1, you have a certain number of consumers who are willing to pay P1, but they only have to pay PE, so they get this sliver of benefit, right? Same thing at P2. Whoops. Same thing for P3. And then I could do that for every single price until I have basically colored in this entire triangle. So, what is the upshot of all of this? The upshot here is that the area, above the price line, So this is the price line. And underneath the demand curve here, of course, limited by this axis here, all of that is my consumer surplus. Okay? Now, I could do the exact same exercise on the producer side, right? I could say that the producers are willing to sell some good at this price, but they get to sell it at price PE, so they derive a little bit of benefit here, right? Same thing at this price, and this price, and this price, and this price, right? Etc. And I could do that for that entire triangle. Okay, so I get that this triangle on the bottom, okay, which would be above the supply curve, okay, to the left, right, of the quantity exchanged line here, below the price line, and of course to the right of this axis, all of that gives me my producer surplus. Okay, so how do we define the total benefit in this market, or the total extra benefit derived by producers and consumers? Very simple. Total benefit, which is equal to economic surplus abbreviated ES, is equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Okay? And economic efficiency, okay, or another way of putting that is the economically efficient point maximizes economic surplus. Now, in our case, what is the economically efficient point? It's our equilibrium point, right? Because any point to the left of our equilibrium point, let's say quantity exchange were not QE, but it were some other number, let's say Q1, would slice off this bit of economic surplus, right? Because all of these exchanges that would have gone on to the right of Q1 would now be canceled, okay? So this here, this part that would be sliced off, this red triangle, is referred to as deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is the economic surplus that is lost when quantity exchanged is less than it should be. It's less than the economically efficient point. Okay? Now, what is the relationship between deadweight loss and price ceilings and price floors, right? Between deadweight loss and price controls? Well, you'll remember that when the government imposes a price floor or a price ceiling, quantity exchanged goes down, right? It falls. So, we have our equilibrium point. Okay, we have our equilibrium point. Now, what happens if the government decides to impose a price ceiling? So, first of all, what is the situation before the price ceiling? You have consumer surplus here, producer surplus there, and this entire triangle here, all of that is your economic surplus, right? Okay, but now the price floor is imposed. And as we saw before, that reduces quantity exchanged to this point here, right? So this is the new quantity exchanged. So what is our deadweight loss? Our deadweight loss is the total consumer and producer surplus that is lost due to the fact that our quantity exchanged has decreased. So that's our deadweight loss. Now, what is our consumer surplus and what is our producer surplus? Remember how I defined consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is above the price line, right? So here's the price line. To the left or below the demand curve, and of course to the right of our axis. So this would be our consumer surplus. What is our producer surplus? Our producer surplus is below the price line. So this is the price line. To the left, right, of our quantity exchanged, above the supply curve, and to the right of our axis here. So this here, this trapezoid, would be our consumer surplus, our producer surplus, sorry. Oh, that should say producer, P. Okay, now let's do the same exercise for a price ceiling. So we've got our equilibrium. Okay, now a price ceiling says that the firm is not allowed to charge more than, say, this amount, which reduces quantity exchanged to this amount here. Again, if this is not familiar to you, I would very much encourage you to watch the previous video. Okay, which creates, of course, a deadweight loss represented by this triangle here. Right? And now, what is our producer surplus? Our producer surplus is above the supply curve. Sorry about that. Our producer surplus is above the supply curve, right? To the right of this axis and below the price line. That's our producer surplus right there. And our consumer surplus is above the price line, which is right here, to the left of the quantity exchange line, below the demand curve, and of course to the right of this axis. So this, in our case, would be consumer surplus. So you'll notice that a price floor causes producers to gain at the expense of consumers, right? Because consumer surplus is decreased, but producer surplus is increased. And of course, society as a whole loses out because of this deadweight loss. And in the case of a price ceiling, consumers gain at the expense of producers because our consumer surplus is bigger, whereas the producer surplus is now relatively smaller. And of course, society as a whole loses because of this deadweight loss. Okay, so that summarizes basically the effects of price controls on on economic efficiency or on economic surplus. Okay. Is there anything else to say about this topic? So that's about it. Well, I should mention that I said that the price ceiling causes consumers to gain at the expense of producers. But of course, if the price ceiling is low enough, then they both lose, right? I mean, if you have a price ceiling that's so low that consumer surplus is reduced to a sliver, then of course that wouldn't be a gain in any meaningful sense. It would actually just depend on the areas, right? So that's in fact basically the last thing to say. To calculate consumer surplus and producer surplus and deadweight loss, it's just a matter of taking areas, right? So in our case, what would we need to calculate the area of this consumer surplus right here? Well, we would know the intercept, right, if we have the demand function, okay? We would know what the price floor is, and we would know what the new quantity exchange is. So we could therefore find the height of this triangle and the base of this triangle. And then it's just base times height divided by 2, right? That's how you calculate the area of a triangle. Now, when it comes to this trapezoid here, you could either use the formula for the area of a trapezoid, or you just have to find this point here. You would already have this point and this point. In that case, you could just calculate the area of a rectangle plus add the area of the triangle down here. If you don't remember how to do all of that stuff, or if you're a little bit unsure just by watching this, don't worry. My next video will actually be a numerical example of how to calculate deadweight loss, consumer surplus, producer surplus, all that stuff in the presence of a price floor or a price ceiling. Okay, so if you found this video useful, like and subscribe, share it with friends, colleagues, and classmates, and I will see you in the next video.